Yeah, my name is Ted DeWells. How many people here are familiar with Leaside, either lived in Leaside at one time or another or live there now? Okay, so most people are pretty familiar with Leaside. I'm just going to give a quick overview of the history of Leaside. It won't take too long. Leaside has been in existence officially for over 110 years. It was settled in the very early 19th century by a man named John Lee. And he came to Leaside, I think, from England in the 1820s. He built one of the first stone house in Leaside. His descendants, John Lee Jr. and William Lee, built homes in Leaside as well. William Lee built a home in the 1860s that was eight-sided home, an octagon home. And that home was located near the Leaside train station. And when the Canadian National Railways was deciding where to locate their next depot, they decided to do so in Leaside, near the home of William Lee. And they decided to call the area that they were settling near Leaside after his homestead. Leaside was a town created by a railroad. Okay, it did not exist as a town. It was an artificial creation by a railroad to make money for their venture. They hired a landscape architect to lay out the city's plan long before anybody even lived in Leaside. By 1913, they had created a grid for the entire community. And at the time, there were only 30 or 40 people living in Leaside, mainly farmhouses. They bought up all of that property and created a town with a town plan. And that was how Leaside basically got started. In 1913, it became an official town. They wanted to merge with Toronto. When they were first formed, Toronto said, no, it's going to be too expensive for us to pay for your infrastructure. You're on your own. So Leaside became a separate town from the rest of Toronto. Eventually, it had its own fire department, its own police department, its own school system, and it was an entity unto itself until 1967. Okay, it took quite a while for Leaside to get settled and to get off the ground. The earliest industries to move into Leaside were Canada Wire and Cable, which I'm going to be talking about, and the Durant Motor Company, which I'm going to be talking about. The Durant Motor Company is responsible for the administration building that forms the basis of the Viva Leaside Retirement Residence that you see on the wall there. Those were the two earliest businesses to move, industries to move into Leaside. And why are they important? When Leaside was first laid out as a town, it was deliberately designed so that half of the city would be zoned for industrial use, and the other half of the town, not city, would be zoned for residential use. So anything east of Laird Drive and south of Eglinton was reserved for basically heavy industry. And these two companies that I'm going to be talking about, Durant and Canada Wire, were heavy industries. The rest of the town, west of Bayview and north and south of Eglinton, was reserved for residential occupation. So it was a unique layout, and they did that deliberately. Years later, as Leaside evolved, the town taxed the industries at a higher rate than they did the residences. As a result, for many years, Leaside had the lowest property taxes of any municipality in Toronto. And that drove the rest of Toronto crazy. Then Toronto wanted Leaside to merge with them. And that's when Leasiders said, sorry, you had your chance back in 1913. So it's not going to happen. And that became a big issue all through the 40s, all through the 50s, okay? As Leaside evolved, more and more homes were built, kick-started by Canada Wire and Cable, by the way. The residential development of Leaside was almost non-existent until Canada Wire established itself in Leaside, and as a result of that company, the first homes in Leaside were built along Sutherland, along Airdrie, and along Rumsey Road. Okay, and I'll be talking about that. During the war, before World War II, a second phase of residential development occurred in Leaside along streets such as McNaughton, Donegal, along Bayview, near Millwood. That was in the early 30s. And by the late 30s, early 40s, most of South Leaside, the residential part had been built. So by the mid 40s, prior to World War II or just during World War II, virtually all of South Leaside homes were built. North Leaside homes were built after World War II. So by the late 50s, early 50s, Leaside as we know it today was more or less in existence. The industrial side of Leaside remained industrial right up, I'd say, until the late 1990s. By the early 2000s, the industrial part of Leaside began to scale back and become more retail and commercial oriented. And that's why we've got the big box stores there today. So that's basically a quick thumbnail sketch of the evolution of Leaside. I'm going to be talking about Leaside and Canada Wire and Cable. Before Canada Wire and Cable even came, Leaside was rural. This is what Young and Eglinton, this is what Bayview and Eglinton looked like over 100 years ago. 1910, that's the Robert Cook House up there. But basically, it's a muddy road. And this is what people encountered when they came to Leaside. They didn't even Leaside was called the suburbs. The rest of Toronto called Leaside the suburbs right up until the mid-60s, okay? And they did so because they remembered it being primarily a rural area. That's the town grid. It was designed by a landscape architect called Frederick Todd, okay? And that's an early photo of Leaside Junction, the train station for Canada Northern. And I don't even know if you can see it very well. I'm going to see if my point, that's the Octagon House of William Lee. It burnt down in 1913, okay? But it was still existence in that Toronto World newspaper, had a photo of it in 1912. So this is what the early Leaside looked like. They had no infrastructure back then, none, okay? The whole purpose of the town, when the town was created, I've gone through a lot of the municipal records. Year after year after year, the main business of that town was sewers, water lines, electricity, road work. They had no infrastructure. They were in need of all of these things, okay? As I said, water mains, electricity, gas, road, transportation, housing. It was totally inaccessible. The Overlea Bridge had not been built. So it was very difficult to get to Leaside, which is why when you look at the census records for Leaside in 1913, 1914, 40 people, 40 households, tops, are living in this area. So it was quite remote. The first business to locate here was Canada Wire and Cable. And Canada Wire and Cable was created at a very opportune time in Ontario's history. At the turn of the century, Ontario was on the verge of electrifying, okay? Ontario Hydro had just been created, which caused the Hydroelectric Commission of Ontario, and they were in the process of building the electrical infrastructure for Ontario. One of the great institutions, by the way, of Ontario was Ontario Hydro. You know the history of Ontario Hydro, you know the history of Ontario, basically. Canada Wire and Cable saw an opportunity to make transmission wires for the newly formed Ontario Hydro. And as I said before, the government of Ontario and Ontario Hydro were deeply committed to building the electric infrastructure for Ontario. They decided that Leaside would be a very good place to locate. So they built their first plant in Leaside. This is, I'm not going to read through all of this, but this is basically the history of Canada Wire and Cable. In 1913, they became the first company to locate in Leaside, and they began to build not only their factory, but also were very instrumental in building housing infrastructure for the city, for the town as well. It was founded by a financier called Emil Wahlberg. If you go down to the University of Toronto, go along College Street, there's an engineering building called the Emil Wahlberg Building, named after this guy. He was a major benefactor. When he died, he left all his money to his sister, and his sister left all her money to the U of T, and they created an engineering building which still bears his name at the U of T. This is a very early photo of the construction of the first factory of the Canada Wire and Cable complex. It was a complex. They had more than one building. And this was taken in 1914. When World War I came along, they basically were just starting to get going when World War I came along, and they had to stop production. They didn't stop production quite. They transferred production to building artillery shells for the war effort. So they took their facilities, renamed it Leaside Munitions, and started building artillery shells, manufacturing artillery shells. It was a huge employer. They had as many as 3,500 to 4,000 people working in the factory that they had built to make wire and cables. They retooled it to make ammunition. This was one of the largest manufacturers of 6-inch shells throughout World War I. They shipped them to the UK. It was a very successful operation. They got in trouble. During the war, they employed children. They had 2 14-year-old boys working here, and they got in trouble for doing that, even though their father gave permission. So it was quite an operation. Anyways, that's a great photo of how that happened. They also, like all of these, by the way, all these companies back then, they were pretty good corporate citizens. They all had sports teams. They had soccer teams. They had hockey teams. They had baseball teams. And this is a lacrosse team by Leaside Munitions, had their own lacrosse team. The thing I love about this photo, I love the jerseys. An artillery shell with wings, okay? I'd love to get a hold of one of those jerseys, okay? I'd love to, I think that's really cool. The Leaside Indians lacrosse team, apparently there was a lacrosse league in Toronto at the time. They played other teams, and their nickname was the Shellmen, okay? So the Shellmen are playing tonight. I'm gonna go see a lacrosse game. Anyways, that's a great photo. They were so successful building artillery shells that the U.S. government made a contract with Canada Wire and Cable and say, we want you to build shells for us, but we want 12-inch shells for our guns. So Canada Wire and Cable, which was operating Leaside Munitions at the time, said, okay, but we got to build a new facility to do that. And that's what this photo is. This is a photo of the 12-inch factory for 12-inch guns. Unfortunately, the war ended before they got a chance to complete this building, and the U.S. backed out of the contract. They say, okay, the war is over. We don't need this anymore. Canada Wire and Cable, Leaside Munitions, said, well, you know, you've signed a contract. And the U.S. government said, okay, we'll give you the building if you let us out of the contract, basically. So Canada Wire and Cable was left with this building, which I think there's a story behind this. We'll come back to this later. The other thing I'd like to mention, though, this is 1919. I want you to take a look at that water tower, okay? That became a Leaside landmark for the next 3 decades, for the next 30 years. Canada Wire and Cable, again, the history of Leaside and the history of Canada Wire and Cable are intimately connected. This company did not operate in isolation of the town. It was deeply connected with the municipal affairs of the city and with the welfare of its residents. And one of the key things it did is it built water lines connecting the city of Toronto's water supply to Leaside. So they were highly instrumental in contributing to the essential, fundamental, foundational infrastructure of Leaside when it was created back in the 19 teens. And when they had that water set up, once they built the water infrastructure, they built this big water tower to supply their industrial needs. And it also could supply industrial needs for any other companies that may want to locate in this area. And like I said, that water tower became a landmark in Leaside for the next 35 years. If you lived in Leaside in the 1940s or 1950s, and you drove into the city and you drove up Laird, that would be what you would see. That would say, I'm in Leaside, okay? And they were very proud. You can see right there, Canada Wire and Cable Company Limited, emblazoned in the front. So that was a big landmark for a number of decades. Okay, meanwhile, Canada Wire and Cable, after the war, went back to producing wire cable, transmission wire, underground cable, underwater cable, anything involving the transmission of electronic data, maybe even suspension bridge cables. I'm sure they did that too for construction. And this is a very early picture of a float that every year Toronto had an industrial parade down at the CNE, and all the different companies in Toronto would have floats. It would be like an industrial parade, okay? Canada Wire and Cable participated in this. I like this because it's a great picture of their float. Whoops, I'm going to go back just a little bit. There, okay. This gives you an idea of how big. These are called reels, okay? So they wound the wire on these big round spools, and these became a trademark or a logo for the company for many decades after that. And they were red, and they called it the red reel, okay? So anyways, basically that gives you a rough idea of Canada Wire and Cable. They also, and there's another example of the reels being put on an airplane. Now, Jeremy can tell me a little bit about this. Jeremy knows a lot about the Leaside Aerodrome. I was saying to Jeremy, could they get this, was this plane capable of transporting a reel like this? Would that be too heavy for that plane, Jeremy? Yeah, the little one. I don't think the big one would fit. Anyways, the other reason why the company's located in Leaside, they were right near the Canada Northern Railway Station. So they were so close they could ship. And these are heavy industries. They could ship their product from the railroad to wherever they wanted to and import material for the manufacture of their products using the railroad. Okay, but they also had the aerodrome very close. So in a pinch, I guess, they would sometimes use the aerodrome and the airplanes that were operating there. The only reason I put this photo on, it gives you an idea of what the facility looked like around 1920. After the war, still the primary, one of the one or two primary industries in Leaside. And remember, at the time, 1920s, Leaside by now had maybe 300 people living there. It was primarily an industrial town, okay? This is what Canada Wire and Cable looked like. That's their office building, and that's their manufacturing facility. Apparently they manufactured refrigerators. I didn't know this. I could find no information about what happened to their refrigerator facility, if they had one. It seems to have dropped off the map after 2 or 3 years in the 20s. But the reason why I put this on here, it's a good illustration of the extent of the factory in the mid-20s. Here's a photo of the same thing. And again, you see the iconic, at the time, water tower, and emblazoned at the top, Canada Wire and Cable Company. So you knew you were in a company town when you drove up Laird. Okay, and this is what some of their production facilities look like. Again, like I said before, this became their logo. The reel was the recognizable logo for Canada Wire and Cable. There they are unspooling some of the cables off of these reels. This is not a Leaside picture. It looks like they're near a river or a body of water. So this might be underwater cable that they're unspooling here. Took a long time to do that. As I mentioned before, these were good corporate citizens in many respects. They took an interest in the setting and in the community where they were located. They did not operate in isolation. Canada Wire and Cable, the executives that ran that company, knew that they would not have a going concern unless they could attract employees. And they couldn't attract employees to a remote location like Leaside unless they contributed to building houses for these employees to live in. It was too far for many employees to come. They just go, this was a booming time. This is the roaring 20s. People could work in other places. So they had to make it worth their while and attractive to come to Leaside. So they took an active interest in building affordable homes for employees. And this is a very, very important function that Canada Wire performed. So even before World War I began, they launched a program to build houses for their employees. They started buying land, they secured building permits, they got a contractor, they started construction, they made sure that the homes they built were affordable. The homes that they earmarked for building, the streets that they earmarked for building were Sutherland Drive, Airdrie Road, and Rumsey Road, south of Eglinton. Okay? Unfortunately, construction was suspended during World War I. These are actual minutes from the Leaside Municipal Records showing the homes and the lots that are earmarked for construction and the contractors, the contractor that they identified to do the building. And there's lots of clippings. If you go on, I use a service on the internet called newspapers.com. It's a great, I just type in anything and I get tons of information. They've got thousands of newspapers and I pull up all sorts of information about whatever I'm looking for. And anyways, you can find lots of information about Canada Wire and House. After the war, okay, they built some houses before World War I. Then they stopped building these houses. Then after the war, they really ramped up their housing initiative. And this is the man that led that. He was a Canada Wire Canada Wire and Cable executive named Herbert Horsfall, and he also became president of the Leaside Housing Company, which was a subsidiary of Canada Wire and Cable. And he basically spearheaded their housing initiative throughout the 1920s. In addition, he was a municipal councilor and he became mayor of Leaside from 1924 to 1930. Again, these guys are executives. They are not operating just as business people. They are intimately connected to the community. They are involved in the municipal council. They are mayors. They are involved as members of the school boards. They are on the planning committees. So again, the connection between the business and the community was intimate, okay? And that's why I've sort of highlighted his other functions. He is a very instrumental person in the history of early Leaside. Leaside probably wouldn't be what it is today without this man. Very important. They identified an architect to design these houses. They went out of their way to get an architect who was committed philosophically to affordable housing for lower income people. And his name was William Somerville. He became one of the most famous and significant architects in Ontario and Canadian history. Okay, he designed McMaster University, he designed the Rainbow Tower in Niagara Falls, and he designed the Cotter Elliott House, which is an award-winning home in Mississauga. Okay, he's listed, if you go in the Canadian Dictionary, Biographical Dictionary of Architects, the list of achievements of this guy is amazing. He was just beginning his career when Canada Wire identified him. to build houses for Leaside. Okay, so it's pretty impressive. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie Niagara with Marilyn Monroe. There's a scene where Marilyn Monroe is walking away from the camera, as only Marilyn Monroe can walk, okay? And she's walking toward the Rainbow Tower, okay? And it's the Carillon is playing in the distance. It's a very famous scene. He designed that tower, okay? So just a little side note there. This is the designs he did for the houses. 1919, okay? He had a complete set of designs set up for what the houses in Leaside are to look like for people who want to work for Canada Wire and Cable. Okay, most of them were semi-detached, but there were a few detached homes, and the focus was on affordability. Okay, very specific criteria. Brick, 2 stories, he had 2 or 3, 5 different designs, 30-foot frontages. The price at the time, affordable, $2,800 to $3,000. Okay, some they rented out. Okay, he also had the floor plans. They were published in the Toronto World and in an engineering publication called Contract Record. One is for a single dwelling family, the other is for a semi-detached. Okay? And the houses still exist today. These houses, that's his sketch over 100 years ago. That's the sketch from 1919. Those are the houses today on Airdrie. Okay? And you can see the pattern. Okay? A single dwelling home flanked by 2 semi-detached. And that pattern repeats itself 2 or 3 different times on Airdrie, on Sutherland, and on Rumsey. So by 1924, Canada Wire and Cable had built all these houses. Okay? Close to 60 houses in all. Okay? And as you can see, Durant Motors is already in existence by that time. And the other major company was Canadian National Railway. But this is the industrial area of Leaside, and this is the residential. Look at all the empty lots, even in 1924. Still a very sparsely populated community. Those lots are not going to turn orange for another 10 years, okay? But the kickstart, the catalyst to get the housing developed in Leaside was begun by Canada Wire and Cable. Very instrumental. I've got some photographs of these homes too, not just drawings. This is the earliest photograph of a Canada Wire and Cable home, prior to World War I. It's from the Toronto World, June 1914, 2 months before the start of World War I. It looks, I apologize, I couldn't get it any clearer. It looks like it's a semi-detached house. So they did build a couple of houses before the start of the war. After the war, things really got going. This is a photo from the Toronto World, 1920. That's Rumsey Road. If you go into the Leaside Library and look out their back window, you will see these houses today. Okay? This house is that house. Okay? These houses still, many of these houses still exist. These are the houses on Airdrie in the back. And unfortunately, there's a lot of show-through for the newspaper, but if this was a better photo, you'd see Canada Wire and Cable and in the background. So that's another early photo. This is a great photo. Okay, this is Rumsey Road. These are newly completed Canada Wire homes. I have no idea what this guy's doing, but he obviously works for Canada Wire and Cable. Airdrie Road, the homes here, it's a photo, they're still under construction. These homes probably still exist. Mitch and I have tried to figure out exactly which homes these are. We haven't been able to figure it out yet, but they very well may still exist. But you can clearly see they're still being built in the early 1920s. This is one of my favorite photos. This photo is taken from the roof of the in-process being constructed Durant administration building. And it's looking west onto Sutherland Drive. These houses are Canada Wire homes, the back of them, that were newly constructed, because it's 1928, so they were about 3 or 4 years old, let's say, around this time. And look at, here's the pattern. Okay? As you can see, you've got a semi-detached, and I think that's a detached house in the middle. Okay? But these are all Canada Wire homes, newly constructed. And that's a great photo, and this is available in Toronto Archives. And then here is an aerial view, and from 1929. Most of them have been built by now. Like I said, about 60 were built in all. Okay, and that's what they look like. Sutherland Drive, Airdrie, and Rumsey. And like I say, this was a kickstart for housing development in Leaside. They were flexible homes, okay? The people who lived in these homes lived there for decades and sometimes generations. This is a Canada Wire home, still exists. It's on Airdrie. It was lived in by a Canada Wire and cable employee called Alex Campbell. He had 11 children, okay? They all lived in a semi-detached house. One bathroom, okay? I grew up in a house with one bathroom. I had 3 siblings, and that was a challenge, okay? I have no idea how these people did it, but they did it, okay? And it wasn't uncommon.
Mostly boys, so
Yeah,
have girls.
that's right. Okay, and these are what the houses look like today. There's a number of them that are still in existence. There was a display about 10 years ago called Hidden Amongst Us that was showcased these houses. At the time, they didn't know who the architect was. Okay, we now know who the architect was and much more of the history behind these houses. And then this is just a sort of a summary of the significance of the Canada Wire homes. Like I said before, they kick-started housing development in Leaside. They were affordable. They were egalitarian and utilitarian. They were but the executives lived in these houses too. And a lot of people say, Herbert Horsfall, the president of Canada Wire and Cable and Leaside, he lived in one of these houses for a couple of years. Not because he was trying to take advantage of a cheap price, but the connection, again, between the executives and employees, between people who ran the companies and were involved in the community, was very intimate. There was no such thing as a gated community back then, okay? If you were an executive and a quote-unquote elite person, you lived with everybody else. They knew you, you knew them, your children dated their children, okay? I don't want to romanticize this period, but it was different from the way it is today, okay? And again, like Leaside Munitions, they were involved in the community in other ways. As good corporate citizens, they sponsored baseball teams. They had their own baseball teams. They had a women's softball league in the 1930s. They had a tug-of-war team that won. Every year they would compete at the CNE, and they very often won. I'd love to get those jerseys or those trophies. Okay, they had picnics for their employees. Okay, during the war, they contributed significantly to the war effort. They operated 24/7 during World War II. Okay, they produced aircraft wires, Navy cables, field telephones. They built nets to capture submarines trying to infiltrate harbors, or nets to capture mines that were planted in harbors. Okay, so they did a lot of war work. They contributed to war bonds. And these are ads from the war saying this is what Canada Wire and Cable is doing for the war effort. After the war, they rehired employees. They rehired disabled employees. This employee has no hands. Okay, he used to work for Canada Wire and Cable. He was injured during World War II. Obviously, they hired him back. They ran a story on him. Okay, I thought this was cool. They had comics, Canada Wire and Cable comics. This is a comic advertising Canada Wire and Cable products. They had problems in the 50s. They had a couple of employee strikes. Okay, the company was doing well. So were the workers, and the workers formed a union. Company didn't go for the contract. The union struck. The strike lasted over 100 days. They had another 100-day strike later on in the 50s. So in the 40s and the 50s, they had a couple of strikes. They got over it, But again, I don't want to romanticize this company or sentimentalize it, okay? They did have issues, okay? But they survived the issues and they worked it out. Then in the 1950s, they got rid of their famous landmark. They tore it down. It was big news. Made the Globe and Mail, made the Toronto Star. Big story. People wrote in about the memories they had of the tower, and they replaced it with what they called a vulcanizing tower, which I guess they used to coat wires. They would drop the wires and then they would coat them with rubber or something. They needed this big, tall structure to do that. For the next 30 years, this became a landmark in Leaside. When I moved into Leaside in the year 2000, they had already torn down Canada Wire and Cable. This was the only thing that remained. And I remember this. This was here for a long time. So this, to me, was part of Leaside as well. This and this became the two Leaside landmarks. So Canada Wire left its mark. And again, they did things like they had their own library. If you went to an event sponsored by Canada Wire, they sometimes would give you a book, any book. It could be a famous book by, I don't know, Mackenzie King. And they'd put their own dust jacket on it, and they'd present it to you as a gift. They had an employee, when you were hired by Canada Wire and Cable, they gave you an employee booklet or brochure. There's a great biography or history of Canada Wire published in 1978 by a Canada Wire executive. It's called The Red Reel. This is available in the Leaside Library and the Toronto libraries. So again, they have a lasting legacy. They expanded even more in the mid-1950s. They had plants all over Canada, not just in Leaside. And by the 1970s, they had taken over a huge part of the industrial park of Leaside. This is sort of Canada Wire in its heyday. They took over the old Durant plants, used their facilities. There's the extruder tower right there, still there. Okay, there's some other Leaside businesses over here. But again, this is the administration building for Durant, which I'll talk about in a little while. But anyways, eventually, though, they were sold. On the right-hand side, you could see what happened to Canada Wire and Cable in the 90s. They were sold to Alcatel. That property was sold to developers. The extruder tower was demolished. And as I said before, in its later history, the industrial area of Leaside became much more commercial and retail. This is what Leaside looked like for most of its history. Now this area is primarily Longo's, Best Buys, whatever. You know, we have a lot of different areas, a lot of different facilities, more retail focused. Again, though, they've continued to sponsor baseball, hockey teams, okay? And they still exist with this company, Nexans, okay? Nexans is more or less inherited the legacy of Canada Wire and Cable. They have a big plant in Fergus, Ontario. I'd love to go there and see if they have any material left. When Canada Wire folded, they gave a lot of their material to Todd Morton, but they also gave a lot of their archives away to employees. A lot of their archives are lost, unfortunately. So a tremendous history of Leaside and of Ontario and of Canada has probably disappeared with the disappearance of Canada Wire and Cable. That's my experience with companies. A lot of companies don't take care of their archives, and I wish they did, because they're intimately connected with the history of this country and of this province. The other big company I want to talk about quickly is the one that more or less is about what we're talking about here at Viva Leaside, is Durant Motors. Okay, Durant Motors is the other big industrialized company. This is a brief history of them. They came to Leaside in 1921, and they were created by the same person who created General Motors, William Durant. He was a founding member of General Motors. He was an entrepreneur, brilliant guy, very famous in the history of the automobile industry. They pushed him out of GM a couple of times, and by the late teens, early 20s, he decided to form his own car company called the Durant car company, an eponymous name. He had 3 plants in the U.S., and he decided to build a plant in Canada. He chose Leaside. Came up to Leaside, and guess what? He gets a call from Emil Wahlberg saying, "Hey, Bill, I've got a building you could probably use. It's a building we were going to build 12-inch shelves for the U.S. government. And you feel like, if you want, we've got something." So Durant, I don't know if I'm making this up about the phone call, okay? But Durant ended up purchasing from Canada Wire that building that you saw half completed. And they used that was completed by the time, as the beginning of their production for cars. They immediately built adjoining buildings onto that. But they purchased from Canada Wire and Cable the munitions building and then added on to that very quickly. By 1921, this is an artist's picture of what they thought it was going to look like. By 1921, they were formally established in Leaside, and within a few months, they had built adjoining buildings. They built these facilities in something like 4 months, okay? This is the rest of the production facilities for Durant, okay? 6 buildings built in 4 months compared to the LRT, okay? I think a little bit faster. They didn't have to worry about, little things like environmental assessments or community consultation. They just went ahead and built. Still, it's impressive. It's really impressive. I mean, they built the Empire State Building in 13 months, okay? They built this in 4 months. I mean, they built things fast back then, okay? This is what the plant looked like in the mid-20s, okay? This is before they built their administration building, okay? Whoops, sorry. Okay. This is Canada Wire and Cable, but this is Durant. This is all Durant. Jeremy, are these airplane hangars from the aerodrome?
Those are leftover World
Okay, and Durant operated these, or Canada Wire and Cable?
Canada Wire and Cable held those. They bought them as surplus after.
Okay.
And they kept using them to store reels in.
Okay, so Canada Wire and Cable use these to store reels in, but this is all Durant, and this is Durant, okay? So these are, again, and there's the iconic water tower. Okay, these are the 2 main buildings. So Durant is doing pretty well. As you can see, this is from Maclean's magazine. They're producing 100 cars a day, okay? They've had an annual payroll of $750,000. Big company. Assembly line, okay? In the first 2 years of production, they manufactured 13,000 cars. They had almost 500 dealers across Canada. It was the 3rd largest car manufacturer in Canada. They had 700 to 900 employees. Okay, major operation. Again, mid-20s. Leaside itself has 400 people, 500 people. Okay, so these 2 companies were basically the cornerstone of Leaside for a number of years. I'm not going to do this, but if you go on YouTube and type in Durant Motors, you will see a video of their assembly line. It's a good video. It goes on for about 10 minutes, and these are stills from that video. This is what the production line looked like. These are star cars. This is a sedan. These photos are from, I think, the late 20s, early 30s. This is the Leaside plant. When the cars were completed, they put them out in front of the buildings, and dealers came to the company and drove the cars away to their showrooms. That's how they delivered a lot of these cars. They were called drive-away events. Okay, there's another drive-away events. Okay, these are some ads for the Durant car that appeared in the newspapers, the local newspapers in the late 20s. Billboards advertising the Durant cars. A dealership for the Durant Car Company. I think that's on Dundas. I'm not sure. Okay. This is an engine plate. You knew it was built in Leaside if it had the letter T next to the serial number. Okay? It says Leaside there, but if it doesn't say Leaside and you've got the letter T, it indicates it was built in Leaside. Okay? In the early 30s, the American parent company defaulted on its loans to the Canadian company, and the Canadian part of Durant took over the ownership of Durant. And it was run by a guy named Roy Kirby, who was a very good executive, and he was a Canadian. He was a staunch Canadian. He then took over Durant from the American side. So it was a wholly owned Canadian company in the early 30s. They only operated for a couple of years, and they were taken over by a company called the Dominion Car Company. And by the mid 1930s, because of the Depression, they more or less had ceased operation, and they faded from view by the early 1940s. But for a while, the Dominion Car Company manufactured a car called the Frontenac, and that was and many of these cars still exist. And there are car clubs devoted to Durant and to Frontenac cars, and so that's what this ad is all about. Okay, this is this is a restored Durant. Sorry, this car is on. there's a car company on Laird called Gyro Motors. They bought a Durant. That's an original Durant produced in Leaside. You can go online and see a video, or you can go to Laird Drive, go into Gyro Motors, go into their showroom, and you'll see an original Durant car. Okay? These are some brochures. Oh, hey, thanks. I had one too, and I forgot. These are original brochures from the Durant. You can go on eBay or Etsy and buy this stuff. Okay? We have a couple in our Leaside Heritage group. They even had a song. They developed a song based on the Durant. Feeling mighty lonesome. I'm feeling mighty blue. I'm parted from my sweetheart and I don't know what to do. With my favorite auto, I had chased the miles away. Durant, the ones I'm meaning. And this is what I say. Everybody. Okay, so that's a song. Okay, and the sheet music is available. I'm really bad at playing the piano, but I'm going to give this music to my teacher and have him play it and maybe record it and see what it actually sounds like. So they had a song devoted to the Durant, a lot of memorabilia, a lot of legacy. They manufactured a truck, too, called the Rugby. And in the late 20s, Durant Car Company donated a Rugby truck to the Leaside Fire Department. Remember I said Leaside was a separate town, had its own fire department? Durant gave them a fire truck. They kept that fire truck in operation right up until the mid-1950s. Then they used it for parades. Look how small it is. Okay, this is from 1950. There's a parade. The fire department had an annual fire safety parade in Leaside in the 1950s, and they always brought out their Durant truck. Then they sold it, and a bunch of kids bought it in the 1960s, and the kids would drive this truck. Whenever they heard a fire alarm go off, they'd drive the truck to where the fire was happening, hoping, I guess, they could use it. I don't know. Jeremy is trying to figure out what happened to this truck, and he's got a couple of leads, but we haven't quite identified where it is yet. It may still exist.
The Scarborough Lions had it for years, or if that's the one, and a gentleman in Scarborough owns it now, and he's going to bring it, I think, to next year's Leaside. So he's still trying to search the VIN number, though, and there's nothing coming back so far. So
that'd be great. If we could locate that, that would be terrific. Okay, now I'm going to talk about something that's directly related to this event. This is the administration building of the Durant Motor Company. Not the factory, it's where their offices were. They built this in the late 1920s. Production was going really well. They needed more space to produce cars, so they dedicated their offices to production and went across the street and built a 3-story administration office building for the office staff and for the executives. They announced it in the late 20s. Again, 7 months to build, didn't take long, okay? They had an architect, they had a good contractor. It was complete and constructed, ready for occupancy in about 7 months, and it existed and it still exists, okay? A lot of people think these crosses are crosses. I think they were just Gothic. This is a neo-Gothic design. And I think these are just architectural flourishes. I don't think there's any religious significance behind them. But later on, the Toronto Catholic School Board moved into this building, and the crosses were very appropriate. The Toronto Archives has 6 photos showing the construction of this building that is now the Viva Leaside Retirement Residence. They're great photos, high quality. I've seen them. That's where I got these pictures. This photo was taken in September 29. Again, I love this photo because you see the Canada Wire houses in the background. But the foundation is there, September 29. 1 month later, they got the first floor, at least the exterior to the first floor, almost up. Okay, by November, they've made even more progress. They've got these steel girders up for the second floor. This is the back part of the building. And I like this because you can see Canada Wire and Cable, but also Durant had the huge words Durant on its manufacturing building on the other side of Laird. And you can just see the D-U-R-A from that, okay? But this, again, this is facing west, and if you go this way, you're going to the back of Sutherland Drive. Beautiful photos, almost done. December 24th, 3 months later, it's virtually finished. And the completed building, 1929. So it didn't take them long to build. And then they moved in, and they took a photo of everybody who worked there. Again, this was taken in 1929. I love this photo, looking at the faces of people who lived 100 years ago. They all lived on Laird Drive. They all worked in that building right there. Those people lived and worked in that building. Late 1920s, they got the cloth hats, they got the bobbed hairstyles. All the executives, the accountants, the engineers, the staff secretaries. This guy is Roy Kirby. Okay, he's the guy that ran the company after it became a totally Canadian-owned company. He was a staunch Canadian. When he went to the U.S., his wife would travel with him, but he was so Canadian, he forbade her to buy anything from the States. She'd fit right in today, right? She'd be perfect. Yeah. So, again, great picture. A little bit of our past looking at us from 100 years ago. May 21st, 1929. And then when they had the building complete, they had the driveaways here. So here are all the new Durant Star cars and the rugby trucks in front of the completed Durant building. Great building. Another good shot from the 1930s. And then in the 40s, after the company dissolved, Imperial Oil bought the building, and they added on a building. Imperial Oil bought the Durant headquarters, and they added on this building, and these 2 buildings became its marketing department for a number of years. And these are shots from people working inside the building when it was Imperial Oil. 1950. I don't know. I remember when offices looked like this. This is how old I am. Okay? This is that building, people from Imperial Oil, marketing and sales department. That's a Christmas party they had. One of our members in the Leaside Heritage Group, her parents met. They were both employees of Imperial Oil. They met, dated, and got married when they were employees of Imperial Oil working at that building. Oh yeah, they had a raffle and you got a free chicken. Okay? They don't do that anymore. Okay? And then it was taken over, as I said, by the Toronto District Catholic School Board in the early 60s, mid-60s. They operated it for a while. And then it had a varied history. It was taken over by Methuen Publications, the premises in the late 90s by the Leaside Business Center. Toronto City Council declared it a heritage building. It's now operated by Viva Leaside. This building is now gone. Viva Leaside repurposed it for its residential center, its retirement center, and that's what it looks like today. And that's what the Leaside business area looks like today. As I said, transition, heavy industry to commercial. But these are two seminal organizations that made Leaside what it is today. Thanks very much, folks.